Ciao.
That's sponsored by Remote HQ. Collaborate like you're in the same room. Go to remotehq.co/minutes for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use the code MINUTES for 3 months free. That's Remote HQ.
Don't you think it's so funny? The whole class can stay in for 45 minutes this afternoon. Then you'll see how funny it is.
So he'll trust you, which I guess he will, because, you know, it's The Mandalorian. I can't believe, actually, that this week is the season finale.
Yeah.
It's a little early.
No.
I mean, it's not really, I know, but it's...
No, because the following Friday is Christmas.
For me personally, it's a little early, is what I'm saying. It's come a little... it's been a little too quick this season. But let's move on to other things. Rob Walch is here with us, everybody. Rob Walch of Today in iOS. It pretty much says it right there on the tin. But tell everybody, if you would, what Today in iOS is and where they can find it.
They can find it at todayinios.com, and it's a podcast I started back in 2007 with inspiration from Mac OS Ken, where I said, you know what, I'm just going to follow this little niche of Mac world called the iPhone.
That's crazy. Did you?
Yeah, it was your show, and MacCast. That was what I modeled the show after. So I'm going to take kind of the MacCast and Mac OS Ken. I'm going to merge them, and that's kind of I'm going to make the show Today in iOS.
What were you thinking when you did that? Because I'll be honest, I started doing Daily Mac News because Scott Shepard at whatever that show was called, Inside Mac. Scott Shepard at Inside Mac got me to do that, and then he and I had a falling out, and then I went to Macworld, and a couple of people said, well, when are you going to start again? And I was like, well, okay, I guess there's enough here that people would be interested if I started my own. And I've said on this show and other shows before, my plan was I would do it for 6 months and get a job at CNET. And here I am 15 years later. And while there was a lot about Apple that was really interesting, if you would ask me, are they going to be the most valuable company on the planet? I would have asked you how much you had, where you got it, and did you have any you could spare? There's no way I thought they were going to be the most valuable company on the planet. That said, when the iPhone came out, I did think that it was going to do better than Android, which a friend of mine thought I was crazy. But I was like, well, Apple's going to take all of its money and put it into its phone. And all the Android makers are going to take all of their money and put them into their own phones. And so no one phone, it doesn't seem to me, is going to beat the iPhone, because Apple has a vested interest in making that one thing big, whereas nobody in particular has a vested interest in making any one Android phone big. Granted, it hasn't beat it in terms of... And you were
correct
from
a certain point of view.
Right. It's kind of crazy, right?
From profit point of view,
yeah,
Apple's made the lion's share of the money in the smartphone world.
Well, it's also the biggest phone, isn't it? I mean, I guess occasionally it trades with whatever's in the Galaxy line. But
it goes back and forth. But yeah. Anyway. And now that they have so many different iPhones, you can't say this one iPhone is, you can't say all iPhones are an iPhone. Yeah.
See, that's interesting, because I kind of, with the exception of the SE, I kind of feel like you can, although maybe you have to make a division between the not Pro and the Pro. But anyway, do you remember what you were thinking? Like, did you think, 15 years from now, 14 years from now, I'll still be doing this? I know exactly
what I was thinking when I launched Today in iOS.
Okay.
How do I justify buying this iPhone to my wife? I'll launch a podcast on it, and then I can get the iPhone.
That's great.
And if it doesn't work out after a couple of months, I'll close the show down and I'll have my iPhone.
All right.
That was my thought process.
Well, cool. Way to go. And here we are, 13, 14 years later, or 14, 15 years later, depending on how you look at it, I suppose. I wanted to talk to you about podcasting. It used to be that podcasters would get together and they would talk about podcasting. They would talk about the state of podcasting. At least my impression is that podcasters would do that. Maybe it was just me. But I haven't had this conversation with anybody, at least not, on mic, in quite a while. I'm curious what your take is on the state of podcasting today. And there are a few different ways that we can go. We can talk about the number of Wonderies and, people like that getting into the game or in the game. I'm kind of curious about the changes that you've seen this year, both between politics, which I would assume would actually have increased podcast consumption, and COVID-19, which I don't know what it's done with it. And I guess the one other question I would have for you is, is the boat full at this point, or is there always room for more? So where would you want to start?
We'll go reverse order. The boat's not full.
Okay.
There's some people that will tell you out there that there's 1.6 million plus podcasts in Apple Podcasts.
Okay.
What they don't tell you is that only 350,000 of them have released a new episode in the last 90 days and have 10 or more episodes. So reality is the number of active podcasts in Apple Podcasts is much, much smaller than the number of podcasts because of services like Anchor that have people that go in and create a podcast with one episode and never create any more. Mm-hmm. It's like, hey, I'm a podcaster, Mom. We'll figure out what we're going to talk about and we'll be back. And then they never come back. And the podcast stays in there forever. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of dead podcasts. Matter of fact, 8 out of 9 new podcasts created since the beginning of the year, basically, have not made it to 10 episodes.
Well, this year's been weird. I mean, because we all thought we were going to go inside for a few months. And so one of my favorite, there weren't many good jokes around the time that the lockdown started, but my favorite joke when the lockdown started was, listen, over the next 30 days, you're going to be tempted to start a podcast. Don't.
A lot of people did. A lot of new podcasts came out in the end of March, April. People are like, hey, I'm locked home.
Yeah, why not?
I got 2 extra hours a day now. I don't have to commute. And I'm going to go ahead and do that.
And if I sound, forgive me, I like that joke. I would not discourage anybody from getting into podcasting. I mean, I do have some pretty hardcore advice when people ask me. But that's only because I've seen too many people like rush in and do 2 episodes and then hate themselves for only doing 2 episodes. So I've got like some things that I suggest to people, but I never suggest anybody, no, don't do it. Because if it does that thing for you, and if you connect with, whatever audience it happens to be, that's like crack.
Well, people will email me and they'll say, I'm getting ready to launch my podcast. Mm-hmm. How do I make money with it?
Yeah.
And I just say, you don't make money with it right now. As a matter of fact, most people don't make money. 95% of podcasters never make any money. And the median number of downloads is around 130. That's half the podcasts out there get 130 more downloads after 30 days, half get less. And you're at 130 or 500 downloads an episode, you're not really going to monetize. And if half of them are 130 or less, half are no chance to monetize. So I tell people you have to just launch it and then build an audience. And if you get lucky and you get the right audience and the right niche, you can monetize later on. But people that launch and want to monetize from day one, if your backup plan is to launch a podcast, it's not a good backup plan.
Well, that feels like a strange place to insert a paid message, but let's do it anyway. More with Rob Walch in a moment, but first a word from Remote HQ, letting you collaborate as if you are in the same room. Work's not what it was a year ago. You can't walk over to somebody's desk and show them something. Let's say you want somebody to check out a website or to try to visualize an idea. You can't put something in front of them and point to it. Actually, yes, you can with Remote HQ. Whiteboards, notes, surfing the web. Remote HQ gives you a browser-based place to collaborate, so you can make sure they see what you're saying, not just saying they see it. All of this with no downloads, no installations. Meeting participants don't even have to sign up. They just click the link you send, and there they are. Go to remotehq.co/minutes for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use the code MINUTES for 3 months free. Give Remote HQ a try. Go to remotehq.co/minutes for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use the code MINUTES for 3 months free. And now, more Podcast 411 with Rob Walch. So let's talk about, I don't know, we can talk about 2020. I'm kind of curious what you make of the number of big players that are getting in, and not to be a purist about it, because I remember people yelling at me years ago that I was ruining the spirit of podcasting because I had advertisers. I mean, I remember people saying that, and yet now when I look at, I mean, I kind of went on a rant on my live show saying I don't really want to talk about who Apple has named as their top podcast of 2020, because near as I can figure, there was only one show that was independently produced. And I never expect Apple to talk about me. I never expect Apple to talk about MacCast. I mean, maybe because we're not good enough, but certainly because Apple is not going to promote a podcast that talks about Apple. At the same time, I found myself wondering, where is Brian Ibbott on that list? Where are Don and Drew, if they're still doing their thing? I know Michael Butler is still doing the Rock and Roll Geek Show. I mean, where is anybody who didn't start, where's anybody who started with a microphone and an idea rather than VC money?
There are still. I mean, you can look at Aaron Mahnke from Lore, who started out as an indie podcaster, and then his first podcast was it wasn't doing that great, and then he launched Lore, and that took off, and then that turned into something where he did a partnership with iHeartRadio. But the fact is, Lore is still his show, and he's independently producing it. You could, WTF with Mark Maron is an independently produced podcast. Mark, he couldn't even get a gig at a comedy store to book with a 50-room comedy store when he started his podcast, even though he had been on Air America. He had, his career was at a point where it was over, and he took off. Now, there are other indie podcasters that come along and they do well. And there are some that will get signed by Wondery or signed by this person or that group, and they look for some shows that take off. But there are still independent podcasts. As a matter of fact, overall, 99% of the shows that are out there are independently produced podcasts.
Right.
So, but out of the top, you're right, out of the top 200 or the top ones that Apple picks, you have to take that with a grain of salt. Some of those, but there's still some really big shows. I mean, Dan Carlin, Hardcore History, is independently produced and is bigger than almost every show that Apple had in their top list this year. As a matter of fact, I think it is bigger on a per number episode basis than any of the shows that Apple had listed as top shows. All
right. You've restored my faith a tiny bit. I'll tell you what. Let's you and I talk off mic, and we'll figure out whether we're going to do 2020 in the year of podcasting, or we're going to do the thing that we were going to do. But unfortunately, I think it's time for a commercial.